Hello friends and welcome to House of Props. I'm Buddy and today I'm going to be showing you how I made Batman's grappling gun and the grappling hook. Let's get started. As my base, I'm starting with a 5-inch piece of an 1.25" PVC. And on one end I cut the pipe at a 15-degree angle. Before attaching anything else, I'm going to sand the surface so glue and paints will stick better. While I sand, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and make that bell ring so you can see all the future builds coming down the line. If you are able to, scan this code so you can see all previous builds. To start, I attach part A with a drop of CA glue. This will help with positioning and alignment. The link to the template of all the pieces I'm going to use can be found below. To fully secure the foam to the pipe, I'm using contact cement. A few seconds with a heat gun will speed up the drying process so you can press the surfaces together. I try to make sure that all my foam seams can be hidden. In this case, all seams will be along the bottom of the barrel. Using CA glue, I attach part B to the rear of the pipe. Part B is cut out of mat board. Next, I cut two part C's, one out of 10mm foam and the other out of 6mm. These are then attached to each other. Then attached to part B. Once attached, I use my rotary tool with a sanding drum to smooth and even the edges. Next, I attach part D to part C. Part E is a strip of 2mm foam, which I then glue around the surface of part C. I needed to make sure I didn't cover part D. Using my hobby knife, I score a line around part D. This seam will open up with the heat gun and create a groove. Part F is made by taking a 7/8 inch wide by a 23 inch long piece of 2mm foam and gluing it into a coil. This is then glued onto part D. Once in place, I take my knife again and score lines along part F. Here you can see how these score lines open up with the heat gun. I made part G by gluing two pieces of 10mm foam together and beveling along the bevel lines on the template. This is attached with contact cement on the bottom. Then I scored the lines and heated them up. I just used CA glue to attach part H. And part I can then be aligned and glued as well. Part J should align with the edge of part A when glued into place. Part K is glued along the bottom of the pipe in line with part J. Sorry about this shot, I was focused on aligning the pieces and I went out of frame. If part K sticks off the edge of the pipe, just cut the excess off. Part L is attached the same way. It was at this point I realized I forgot to bevel the edges of part J, so I did that before continuing. Then I used my rotary tool with this tip to carve a groove into part L. Part M is attached to the grip, and this is where the tubing will be attached. Part N consists of a 6mm foam circle the size of the pipe's inner diameter and 4 pieces of 10mm foam stacked and glued together. I then glued this nozzle piece into the open end of the pipe with CA glue. Then I apply a thick layer of quick seal to help smooth the surface of the nozzle. Once the quick seal is dry, I wrap and glue part O around part N. Part P is glued onto the tip of the nozzle. The reason I made this as a separate piece was because we want there to be a noticeable edge between. Part Q is glued onto part O and only wraps about halfway around the nozzle. Using my 1/4-inch hole punch, I cut 6 little circles out of 2mm foam. Two of these are glued onto part E. And 2 onto the ends of part Q, but save the last 2. Then I drill 2 holes where the tubing will attach. This micro fuel line was the cheapest flexible tubing I could find that was about the correct size. It has an outer diameter of 3/16 of an inch. I checked the fit with the 3/16 drilled hole and then glued with CA glue. To help shape the tubing, I inserted a piece of 19 gauge gardening wire. This will help the tubing hold its shape when bent. Once I had the correct shape, I then glued the end of the tube to part M. Then I repeated the process with the second tube. On the other side of part M, I attached the last two 1/4 inch circle punch-outs in alignment with the tubes. Then I took a thin piece of 2mm foam and wrapped this around the bases of the tubes. To make the glue cure faster, I use a drop of zip kicker. I also attach 2mm foam where the tubes enter the PVC pipe. Then I used my hobby knife to score all the 1/4 inch punch outs, and then heat sealed the entire gun. To create the hole for the grappling hook, I used a 3/8 inch spade drill to drill out a hole deep enough that I could glue the 3D printed dart insert into place. The 3D files are included in the same link as the template. Since I'm working with the 3D printed pieces, I start smoothing the surface of the dart with the 120 grit sandpaper. Then switch to a 180 grit. Once the dart is smooth, I prime it with a 2-in-1 filler and sandable primer. If you sand in between layers, you can achieve a really smooth surface. While the primer is drying, I spray the grappling gun with a Plasti Dip. Be sure to apply this in thin layers so you won't get drips and runs. While the Plasti dries, I airbrush the dart with a metallic sterling silver. I attached the dart to this scrap piece of wood so it would be easier to handle while painting. These darts on their own can be used on Batman's gauntlets. But to create the grappling hook, I attach 4 dart hooks to the dart with CA glue. When the glue is dry, I just sprayed the tip again with the sterling silver. To paint the gun, I taped off the areas which need to stay black with painter's tape. I don't need any fancy base because it's going to get weathered, so for the base I'm using this metallic spray paint. Once the silver is dry, I begin to age it by using pavement gray. I brush it on thick and then buff enough away so that I am left with a weathered surface. Then I use a little black acrylic in the deep crevices. To continue the grime effect, I'm using nutmeg brown in areas that would be harder to clean and would collect dirt and grime over time. Then I repeat the process again with burnt umber. Then we have the finished grappling gun. And we can insert the grappling hook. The hook stays in place without any magnets and won't fall out, so you don't need to worry about losing it during a convention. Since we only used EVA foam, some plastics like the PVC, the tubing, and the 3D printed pieces, and a little wiring, it is super con safe. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at Haas of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.